Sometime around 1435, a village near the castle of Tiffauges in the Vendée region of western France, a boy is sent to the castle. He is maybe 10 years old. His family has heard that the Lord of Tiffauges is looking for pages, young servants from good local families who will be educated, fed, and given a future. The Lord is famously generous, famously wealthy, one of the great heroes of France. The boy goes up the road toward the castle. He does not come back. And another. And another. For 8 years, children disappeared from the villages around Tiffauges. Dozens of them, possibly over 100. Local parents whispered. Local priests prayed. Nobody went to the castle and demanded answers, because the man who lived there had stood at the side of Joan of Arc, had helped crown a king of France. His name was Gilles de Rais. He was the most celebrated military hero in France. He was also the most prolific child murderer in recorded European history. In 1429, France was losing the 100 Years' War. The English had been systematically dismantling the French kingdom for decades. The city of Orléans, a critical strategic point on the Loire, was under siege and expected to fall. And then a 17-year-old peasant girl from Lorraine appeared at court and told the Dauphin that God had sent her to save France. Incredibly, he gave her an army. Among the commanders who rode alongside Joan was Gilles de Rais, 25 years old, one of the wealthiest noblemen in France, brilliant and fearless. Together, they broke the siege of Orléans, and on July 17, 1429, Gilles stood at the altar of Reims Cathedral while Charles VII was crowned king. It was the peak of his life. A Marshal of France, the highest military honor. Everything he had done was in service of something he believed in. Then Joan of Arc was captured. Burgundian forces took her in May 1430. Gilles de Rais did nothing to rescue her. She was burned at the stake in 1431. Gilles was 27 years old. He retired to his estates and never fought again. The darkness was about to begin. Gilles de Rais was, by almost any measure, one of the richest men in Europe. He had inherited enormous estates across Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou. He had access to gold mines. He owned multiple castles. The income from his lands was so vast that contemporaries struggled to calculate it. He spent it all. In the years after retiring from military life, Gilles threw himself into extravagance on a scale that contemporary observers found incomprehensible. He maintained a retinue of over 200 servants, more than some kings. He staged theatrical productions at his own expense that required hundreds of performers and elaborate machinery. He ate and drank with a court of hangers-on that swelled his household to grotesque proportions, and he built a chapel, the Chapel of the Holy Innocents, named for the children massacred by Herod in the Gospel of Matthew. Gilles staffed it with over 30 canons and musicians. He dressed them in robes of silk and fur. He bought the most expensive liturgical objects money could procure: golden chalices, illuminated manuscripts, jeweled reliquaries. He attended Mass every day. The name, in retrospect, is one of the most disturbing ironies in history: the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. By the mid-1430s, Gilles was selling off his estates to fund his lifestyle. His family went to the king and had a royal edict issued forbidding him from selling more land. He turned instead to alchemy, convinced he could manufacture gold, and then to demonology, hiring sorcerers and invoking demons in rituals performed in the cellars of his castles. The demons, if they came, left no record, but the records of the children who disappeared from the surrounding villages were very real. For 8 years, the hero of France had been hiding a monster in the dark. The unravelling was about to begin. The historical record for what happened at Tiffauges, Machecoul, and Champtocé comes primarily from the trial of Gilles de Rais in 1440. It was one of the most detailed criminal proceedings of the medieval era. Testimony came from his accomplices, from local witnesses, and from Gilles himself. It painted a picture of a horror that had remained hidden for nearly a decade. Children, mostly boys, aged roughly 6 to 18, were brought to the castle. Some were lured with promises of employment as pages. Some were sent by parents who genuinely believed their children were going to receive an education and a future. A few were simply taken. The accomplices who brought children to Gilles included members of his own household, his cousin Gilles de Rais and his secretary Roger de Briqueville, and 2 servants known as Henriette and Poitou, who were eventually tried alongside him. The trial confessions, given under oath, describe what followed. The children were assaulted and murdered. Gilles killed them himself in most cases. The bodies were burned in fireplaces in his private chambers to conceal the evidence. Over the 8 years his crimes continued, he accumulated the ashes of dozens of victims in the hearths of his castles. He kept the heads of some victims as trophies. The total number of victims is impossible to establish with certainty. The prosecution alleged 140. Modern historians estimate the number was between 80 and 300. For 8 years, it continued. And for 8 years, nobody in authority looked at the castle. The Lord was a marshal of France. He had crowned a king. That is the mechanism of his crimes. Not a locked dungeon, but rank. The absolute social impossibility of a peasant family pointing at one of the greatest noblemen in France. In September 1440, Gilles de Rais lost his temper at a church. He had sold a property and subsequently decided he wanted it back. When Geoffrey's brother, a priest named Jean Le Ferron, arrived to take possession of the castle, Gilles had him seized, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon. Arresting a churchman in a church was an extremely serious offense. It was a violation of ecclesiastical immunity that brought the wrath of the bishop down on the region. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, launched an investigation. He did not investigate the kidnapping of the priest for long. He started hearing other things, whispers from villages, stories about missing children, rumors that had circulated for years but had never been spoken aloud to anyone with authority. On September 15th, 1440, Gilles de Rais was formally charged with murder and heresy. He was arrested at his own castle. The most protected man in France was brought down. His accomplices, Henriette and Poitou, were arrested alongside him. Under interrogation, they confirmed everything. And then, they described more. The trial of Gilles de Rais began in late September 1440. At first, he refused to recognize the authority of the court. He insulted the judges. He called the bishop a villain to his face. But the weight of the evidence and the threat of excommunication was too much. He broke. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confessions in medieval legal history. Gilles de Rais described his crimes in detail. He named his accomplices. He spoke of the children with a specificity that reduced multiple judges to tears. He wept himself, often. Whether his remorse was genuine is a question for history. But he begged for forgiveness from the parents of his victims. He told them that their children were now angels in heaven. The parents wept alongside him. He was convicted on all counts. On October 26, 1440, the hero of Orléans was led out to the Pré de la Madeleine in Nantes. The execution drew an enormous crowd. Gilles de Rais was hanged and burned alongside his accomplices. It was a moment of justice, but also of profound national grief. His body was taken down before the fire consumed it, a privilege of his rank. He was buried in a nearby church. But within decades, something strange happened to his story. It became a fairy tale. Charles Perrault's Bluebeard was published in 1697. It turned child victims into curious wives. It turned horror into a moral lesson about obedience. The fairy tale remembered the monster. It forgot the victims. The actual children of the Vendée, the boys and girls who walked up the road and never came back, vanished from the story entirely. Château de Tiffauges still stands. The ruins are significant. A large round tower, sections of curtain wall sitting above the river Crume. It is a beautiful, melancholy place. The site is open to visitors. There is a museum dedicated to its history. But there is no memorial to the children. Their names were never recorded. Most of their families left no documentation. We know roughly how many there were only because of the families who came forward during the investigation. But the names are gone. They deserve to be remembered anyway. Gilles de Rais stood at the coronation of a king. He was one of the great men of his age. He was also one of the worst monsters in European history. Those two things are not contradictions. To turn his crimes into a fairy tale is to remember the fallen hero and forget the children who went up the road and never came back. We must not forget.